I never meant for anyone to find out about the money. For 3 years, I kept it quiet, carefully, deliberately quiet, the way you keep something fragile wrapped in layers of packing paper long after you've stopped worrying it might break. It started with a small software company I'd built almost by accident, coding late at night in the spare bedroom of my apartment after my day job had gone quiet, solving a scheduling problem for independent contractors that I'd originally built just to fix my own headaches with invoicing. What began as a tool for myself slowly became a tool other people wanted, then paid for, then eventually a company, a mid-sized tech firm, wanted to acquire outright. When the acquisition closed, the number that landed in my account, after taxes and legal fees and everything else that quietly siphons off a windfall before it ever really feels like yours, came to just over $15 million. I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot of my bank the day the wire transfer cleared, staring at the number on my banking app like it belonged to someone else's life. I didn't call anyone. I didn't post anything. I sat there for almost 20 minutes, engine off, just breathing, feeling something that wasn't quite joy and wasn't quite fear, but some strange, disorienting mixture of both. I kept driving my same 10-year-old Honda, the one with the crack in the windshield I never bothered fixing because it didn't actually impair my visibility, just sat there as a small, familiar imperfection. I kept living in the same one-bedroom apartment 2 towns over from my parents, the one with the water stain on the kitchen ceiling I kept meaning to ask the landlord about. I told myself in those early weeks that the money hadn't changed anything essential about who I was, and in most of the ways that mattered to me personally, that was true. What had changed was quieter, more internal. The low, persistent hum of anxiety about money that had followed me since childhood finally went silent. I could breathe in a way I hadn't been able to before. That was enough for me. I didn't need anyone else to know about it to feel it. When family asked how the software thing had gone, I told them simply that I'd sold the business and did okay. I let that phrase do a lot of quiet work, let people fill in their own assumptions, most of which landed somewhere around comfortable. Maybe enough to pay off my apartment, certainly not enough to reshape anyone's life. It was easier that way, and if I'm honest with myself, I think some part of me already understood why I needed it to be easier. My family had always had a particular gravitational pull toward other people's resources, though it took me years to see the pattern clearly enough to name it. My mother had a habit of mentioning needs out loud in front of whichever sibling seemed most capable of addressing them at the time, not quite asking outright, but positioning the need in the air like bait. My father, quieter about it, tended to simply accept whatever got offered without much resistance, a passive participant in whatever version of helping got extended toward him. And then there was my sister, Kendra. Kendra had spent years perfecting something I can only describe as the art of needing help at precisely the moment someone else had something to give. It wasn't calculated in an obvious, cartoonish way. She wasn't rubbing her hands together plotting how to extract money from people. It was subtler than that, almost instinctive, a finely tuned sense for exactly when a crisis of hers might land most effectively in front of an audience capable of solving it. A car repair the same week, I got a bonus at my old job. A temporary loan for rent the month our cousin got a promotion. Everyone was celebrating. Nothing ever quite crossed the line into demand, not until Thanksgiving anyway, but the pattern had been there for years if you knew to look for it. It fell apart at Thanksgiving, 7 months after the acquisition closed, at my parents' house, around the same table I'd eaten at my entire childhood, the tablecloth a familiar faded cream with a small burn mark near the corner from some long-forgotten candle mishap when I was maybe 10 years old. My cousin Dev was the one who broke it open, though I don't think he did it with any real malice. Dev worked in finance, had for years, and apparently had seen the acquisition mentioned somewhere in an industry newsletter he subscribed to for work, one of those trade publications that lists mid-market deals in small print most people never bother reading. He brought it up casually between passing the mashed potatoes and refilling his wine glass, asking how it felt to have sold for 15 mil, saying it the way you might mention the weather, utterly unaware of the silence about to fall over the table. I remember the room going quiet in a way that felt almost physical, a held breath passing around the table from person to person. My mother's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, hovering there for a beat too long before she set it down slowly. My father set his wine glass down with a deliberate, careful precision, like the sound of glass on wood might shatter whatever had just cracked open in the room. And Kendra's eyes lit up with something I recognized instantly, something I'd seen 100 times before in smaller, lower-stakes versions, and something I didn't like seeing now, multiplied by a number this large. $15 million, she repeated slowly, testing the words in her mouth like she needed to feel their full weight before she could believe them. And you never said anything? I tried to keep my voice light, tried to wave it off the way I'd waved off smaller questions about money for years. It's not really relevant to anything, I said. I still live the same life. Same apartment, same car. It doesn't really change day-to-day things. But I could see, even as I said it, that the words were landing nowhere close to where I intended them. Nobody at that table heard. It doesn't change anything. They heard $15 million, full stop, and every subsequent word out of my mouth was just noise layered on top of that number, already reshaping how they saw me, how they saw themselves in relation to me, how they saw what was suddenly, in their minds, possible. By the time dessert came out, my mother's pumpkin pie, the same recipe she'd made every year of my life, the conversation had shifted entirely. My father, usually reserved about money in front of the family, mentioned almost wistfully that he still had 6 years left on the mortgage, a comment that hung in the air with an unmistakable shape to it, even though he never said anything more direct than that. My mother mentioned, in the same breath as asking if anyone wanted more whipped cream, how nice it would be to finally fix the roof that had been leaking intermittently since spring, a repair they'd been putting off because of the cost. Kendra didn't bother with any of that subtlety. She looked directly at me, fork still in hand, and asked outright whether I'd consider helping the family out now that things had changed. Not a question about my life, not curiosity about the business I'd spent years building before any of this, not even genuine congratulations dressed up as anything else. Just the money, and what it might now mean for her. I said I'd think about it, mostly because I wanted the conversation to end, wanted to get through the rest of the meal without it becoming the only subject at the table. I drove home that night with a tight, uneasy feeling low in my stomach, the kind of feeling that tells you something has shifted permanently, that a conversation you thought was closed has actually just opened a door you're not going to be able to shut again easily. I was right. Within a week, the family group chat, usually reserved for holiday planning and the occasional meme, exploded into something else entirely. Not congratulations. Not questions about how the company had actually worked, what I'd built, what the last several years of 80-hour weeks in that spare bedroom had actually meant to me. Instead, Kendra sent a spreadsheet, an actual spreadsheet, neatly formatted with columns and dollar amounts, titled Family Support Plan, itemizing what she called reasonable requests. $80,000 for our parents' roof and remaining mortgage balance. $60,000 toward her own fresh start, a phrase she used vaguely, without elaborating on the divorce details she'd kept mostly private until now. And beneath both of those line items, a final suggestion, phrased with the deceptive softness of something that wasn't quite a demand but functioned exactly like one, that I consider setting up a family fund everyone could draw from as needed going forward. I sat staring at that spreadsheet for a long time that night, the cursor blinking in an empty reply box I never filled in. Something in me went very still, very focused, in the particular way it does right before I start solving a problem instead of just feeling upset about it. I closed my laptop without responding, and I started making a plan of my own. I didn't respond to the spreadsheet. Not that night, not the next day, not even when Kendra sent a follow-up message 3 days later asking if I'd had a chance to look it over, her tone carefully casual in the way that told me she was trying not to seem as invested as she actually was. I let the silence sit there, unanswered, for the better part of a week, partly because I genuinely needed time to think, and partly because some instinct told me that silence itself would tell them more than any argument I could have typed out in the group chat. I could feel the temperature of that chat shifting even without saying anything. My mother sent a message on day 4, something soft and probing, asking how I was doing, whether everything was okay, a question that had nothing to do with checking on me and everything to do with checking on the money. My father didn't send anything at all, which felt somehow more honest than anyone else's approach. He'd never been comfortable directly asking for things, preferring instead to simply wait and see what got offered to him. Kendra sent 3 more messages over those 7 days, each one incrementally more pointed than the last, moving from just checking in to "I know this is a big adjustment for you too" to finally, "I don't understand why you're going silent on us. This isn't like you." That last one almost made me laugh out loud, alone in my apartment, because it was such a precise inversion of what was actually happening. I wasn't going silent out of some petty withholding. I was thinking carefully about what real help would actually look like, as opposed to just transferring numbers out of my account into theirs because a spreadsheet told me to. During that week, I did something I hadn't done in the 7 months since the acquisition closed. I actually sat down and looked closely at my family's finances, or at least the parts of them I could piece together from years of overheard comments, old conversations, small details dropped here and there without anyone realizing they were being filed away. I called my parents' mortgage lender, with my father's reluctant permission once I explained what I wanted to do, and had a long conversation with a loan officer about their current rate, their remaining balance, and what a refinance might actually look like given how interest rates had shifted since they'd first taken out the loan. The numbers surprised me, not because the mortgage was unmanageable, but because they were still paying an interest rate nearly 2 points higher than what was currently available, a detail that had apparently never occurred to either of them to look into. I also quietly reached out to a roofing contractor recommended by a coworker, had them come out and do a full assessment on my parents' house under the guise of getting a quote for a friend, and got a hard number for what a proper repair, not a patch job, would actually cost. It came in lower than I expected, low enough that I decided almost immediately I could simply handle it outright, without turning it into a loan or a gift with strings attached. It felt like the kind of help that solved an actual problem rather than performing generosity for an audience. Kendra's situation took longer to think through, mostly because I didn't actually know the real shape of it. I didn't know the details of her divorce beyond vague references to things being complicated and expensive, didn't know whether the $60,000 she'd requested was meant to cover legal fees, moving costs, debt from the marriage, or something else entirely. I called her once during that week, not to discuss the money directly, but just to ask how she was doing, genuinely, the way I probably should have been asking for months already instead of only noticing her struggles once a specific dollar amount got attached to them. She was guarded on the phone, clearly expecting the call to be about the spreadsheet, softening only slightly when she realized I was actually asking about her, about how she was managing day to day, about the kids' schedules, and whether the divorce proceedings were close to finalizing. Underneath her careful, controlled tone, I could hear something that sounded almost like exhaustion, a kind of tiredness that had nothing to do with money directly, but everything to do with the accumulated weight of the last year. I didn't bring up the spreadsheet at all during that call, and I think she noticed because near the end she asked, almost too casually, "So did you look at what I sent?" "I did," I said. "We'll talk about it properly soon." I spent the rest of that week putting together what I eventually brought to Thanksgiving's uncomfortable epilogue. Not a check, not a wire transfer, but 3 folders, each one built around what I'd actually learned rather than what had been requested. I invited everyone to dinner at my apartment, the same modest 1-bedroom apartment they'd all been in dozens of times over the years, the crack in my windshield still there in the parking lot outside for anyone who cared to notice it on their way in. I think some part of me wanted them to sit in that same familiar space one more time before whatever was about to happen between us shifted things permanently. I cooked a simple dinner, the way I always did, roast chicken and vegetables, nothing elaborate, deliberately unchanged from any other family dinner I might have hosted years earlier, when there was no $15 million sitting in the background of every conversation. I let everyone eat, let the conversation stay light and unremarkable for as long as it could, before I brought out the folders after the plates were cleared. My parents' folder went first. Inside was an invoice, already paid in full, for the roof repair, not a patch, a proper replacement, scheduled to begin the following week, arranged directly with a contractor without either of them having to lift a finger or spend a cent. Alongside it, I'd included the refinancing paperwork I'd worked through with a loan officer, a clear breakdown showing how switching to a better rate would save them nearly as much money over the life of the loan as the lump sum payoff they'd originally asked for, without me simply erasing a debt they were fully capable of managing on their own, at better terms, with a little guidance. My father read through it slowly, his reading glasses low on his nose, and I watched something shift in his expression as he got to the interest savings calculation near the bottom of the page. "This is actually more than I expected," he said quietly, almost to himself. I didn't think about the interest side of it at all. My mother stayed quieter, flipping through the pages with an expression I couldn't fully read, somewhere between confusion and the beginning of understanding, like she was recalibrating what she'd expected against what she was actually holding in her hands. Kendra's folder was different, and I watched her face carefully as she opened it, wanting to see the exact moment her expectations collided with what I'd actually decided. Instead of the $60,000 she'd requested, I'd arranged and prepaid 6 months of sessions with a financial counselor who specialized specifically in post-divorce recovery, someone with strong reviews and a track record of helping people rebuild not just their bank accounts, but their actual financial habits and stability going forward. Alongside that, I'd included a clearly labeled, modest gift of $5,000, meant to cover whatever immediate expenses she might be facing right now, without pretending that amount was meant to solve anything larger. I watched her face shift through several stages in the span of about 10 seconds. Anticipation, confusion, and then something harder, sharper, settling into place as she realized this wasn't going to be the number she'd written into her spreadsheet. "This isn't what I asked for," she said, her voice tight. "I know," I said, keeping my own voice as calm and warm as I could manage, deliberately steady rather than defensive. I looked at everyone's situation individually instead of just handing out the numbers from the spreadsheet, because I didn't want to just be an ATM that fixes things by making them disappear. The roof's done, already scheduled, no strings. The refinancing option for mom and dad is real, and it's actually better than what they're currently paying. And Kendra, I know this year's been hard since the divorce, genuinely I do. But throwing $60,000 at it, without dealing with whatever's underneath, it isn't really help. It's just delay. This counselor is excellent. I've already covered 6 months, and if it's useful, we can talk about extending it. The silence that followed wasn't like the silence at Thanksgiving, that shocked, hungry stillness of people recalculating what was suddenly possible. This one felt deflated, uncertain, the sound of people realizing that the windfall they'd already started spending in their imaginations wasn't going to materialize the way they'd pictured it. Kendra broke it first, her voice sharp with a particular outrage of someone who feels cheated out of something they'd never actually had a real claim to in the first place. "So you're saying no," she said. "After everything, you're just saying no." "I'm saying I looked at what would actually help versus what would just move numbers around for a little while," I said. "The family fund idea, I thought about that one the longest, honestly. And I decided I couldn't do it because it wasn't really a fund in any meaningful sense. It was an open invitation for me to become the default answer to every future problem this family runs into, without anyone having to change how they actually handle money going forward." My father looked at the roof invoice and the refinancing paperwork again, quiet for a long moment, before folding the folder closed with something that looked almost like reluctant respect. "This is more useful than the $80,000, honestly," he admitted. I hadn't thought through the interest at all. My mother still didn't say much, though I caught her studying her folder with an expression that had softened slightly by the end of the meal, even if she wasn't ready to say so out loud yet. Kendra, though, wasn't finished. She accused me of being controlling, of wanting to dictate how everyone lived their lives instead of simply giving them what they'd asked for, of using the money to feel superior rather than to actually help anyone. I let her get all the way through it before responding because somewhere underneath my own frustration, I understood that some of what she was saying came from a real place of struggle, even if the way she'd chosen to address that struggle had been to treat my success as a shared resource the moment she learned it existed. "I'm not trying to control anyone," I said quietly. "I'm trying to help in a way that doesn't just recreate the same problem again in 2 years. If you want to actually talk about what's going on since the divorce, really talk about it. I'm here for that, genuinely. But I'm not writing a check to a spreadsheet that showed up the same week you found out what I was worth." She left early that night, still angry, still convinced I'd wronged her by refusing to simply hand over what she'd already decided she was owed. My parents stayed longer, and by the end of the evening, my father had pulled out his phone to look more closely at the refinancing details, asking real questions for the first time instead of simply waiting to see what might be offered to him.